Okay, colleagues, so hello and welcome back. Now, today I want to tackle a slightly more technical issue, though I will try to state it as simply as possible, so that hopefully everyone will be able to follow, regardless of your background in the topic. So, the issue is the so called systems reply to Jean Searle's Chinese room argument. So, broadly speaking, the question is about what we mean by the word consciousness. What does it mean to say that human beings are conscious? And potentially, how would you know that other organisms or systems, broadly speaking, are conscious? So, whether animals are conscious? If you hypothetically found an alien, was it conscious? And, of course, something that gets a lot of people excited is whether computers can be conscious. So, Jean Searle has a fairly straightforward argument. Without going into detail, it boils down to the following. Computers are abstract systems for symbol manipulation. That's what they essentially do. So you could, by your own actions, simulate, quote unquote, what it feels like to be a computer. So the particular example goes as follows. You imagine you are sitting in a closed room, and there's like an input window and an output window. And through the input window, you get a question in Chinese. And by hypothesis, you do not know and do not understand Chinese. But you also have a manual, so to speak, and a cupboard or something with Chinese characters, or I should say pieces of paper with Chinese characters written on them to compose your reply. Now again, by hypothesis, you have no idea what the message says, so you look up the characters, the input characters that is, in a manual. And strictly according to the rules of the manual, without actually understanding what any of this means, you construct a reply. Okay, so now let's imagine this is all a part of a Turing test, and somehow the test is constructed without taking your time to reply into consideration, which I think we can grant for the sake of the experiment. Okay, it's not that important. Just to be slightly more vivid, let's imagine this is a version of a Turing test where the conversation takes place in a form of an old-fashioned exchange of paper letters that just take 2 weeks to travel by mail, or maybe a month to travel by mail one way. So a reminder, basically what Turing said, and the purpose of the Turing test, is that when you're able to construct a machine that can hold up its end in a conversation with another human being, that is able to converse to such a level of proficiency that a real human being would not be able to tell the difference. That is, would not be able to tell whether he or she is talking to a machine or to another human being. So basically, when from a functional standpoint, you cannot distinguish man from machine in a conversation, there is no reason, no serious, rational, logical reason, says Turing, why you would attribute consciousness to human beings and not attribute, roughly speaking, the same level of consciousness to a computer. So, a million different things to say. Let me try to stay focused, but a small digression. So, I do think that Turing is clearly onto something. After all, those of you who are familiar with the works of Descartes, for example, will have gone through this hypothetical thought experiment where you imagine that you are the only conscious being in the universe, and everybody else in your environment, all the people that you know and talk to, are just zombies or machines or automata, robots, androids. Like, they go through the motions of behaving a certain way, but actually they are not conscious on the inside. Obviously not the exact examples that Descartes uses, but close enough. But again, if you take somebody who is closest to you, and you have no surefire way of guaranteeing that they are actually conscious and not a zombie, then Turing would say, effectively, like at the end of the day, you do attribute consciousness to them, not because you have some access to their metaphysical soul, but merely because they act in a certain way. So ultimately, Turing would say that already today we talk about consciousness, ascribing consciousness to other people or animals. I mean, I have 2 cats and a dog, and I think all 3 of them are fairly conscious. So again, my reason for ascribing consciousness to them is functional. So if I can functionally converse with a computer with the same level of sophistication as I would with a real human being, then it is just metaphysical prejudice to not assign consciousness to the computer. Okay, I hope we're good. Now back to Searle. Searle says, yes, epistemologically, you may not be able to verify, you may not be able to tell the difference, but that does not mean that there actually is no difference. Sometimes this is known as Qualia Problem, or absent Qualia, or Qualia Problem. That we know from inside of our head that outward behavior, functional behavior, is not the only thing that goes on. We also have these subjective, first-person ontological, qualitative states of mind, which are, as far as we can tell, irreducibly subjective. So back to the Chinese room. You're sitting there in the room, letters come in, you manipulate symbols mindlessly, letters go out, and the person on the other side is convinced that you can speak Chinese, speak and understand. However, you know full well that you do not know a single word of Chinese, and you do not understand anything. And yes, there is outward behavior. You are producing it by sitting in this room together with a manual and these bits of paper with Chinese characters pre-written on them, out of which you construct your reply. You could say a printing press or a keyboard, by the way. So the conclusion is, since you don't know Chinese, therefore the Chinese room does not know Chinese, therefore a computer cannot be said to know Chinese, even if it's able to hold up its end in a conversation. So that's the story. Now to give you the so-called systems reply, and a brief comment from me on it. Now before we get to the systems reply, I hope you can see the force of the argument. And in general, this virtual conversation between Turing and Searle, I think is really fascinating and interesting in all sorts of ways. And I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about both, and the broader context, as a matter of fact. And I think we should be deeply suspicious of simple answers to this problem one way or another. I think on a certain level this is a genuine conundrum, and worth thinking through at least to some extent. Now, at the end of the day, I want to say, in a Humean fashion, I personally just stopped worrying about this problem. Because this problem, sometimes known as the hard problem of consciousness, called so by Dave Chalmers, so this hard problem of consciousness seems like completely immaterial, completely academic with respect to everyday life. It is exactly the kind of Humean question, again I'm referring to David Hume, a question that we can entertain while sitting alone in a dusty library or something. But as soon as we go out into the street, as Hume says, nature, our nature, human nature, becomes too strong for principle. So human nature or human passions overpower our abstract considerations. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, as Hume says. So we go out into the street and we forget all of these deep philosophical problems. Problem of induction, the problem of extreme skepticism, the problem of solipsism, etc., etc. It's virtually impossible to sustain these thoughts for any prolonged period of time during normal everyday life, the kind of life that human beings lead. So I'm a professional philosopher for the past 10 years. I wake up in the morning worrying about Hume's problem. And then I realize, Jupiter, no, I'm late for class. And all of my skepticism evaporates that second. My heart rate doubles, and I run as fast as I can, frantically looking at the watch, every second or so. Let me not continue this example, but I think in general it is a deep insight. As a brief aside, when people talk about relationship between reason and passions, very often people talk as if it's good to be rational and it's bad to be emotional. Well, I think this particular example inspired by Hume illustrates very clearly that it is both impossible and completely inappropriate to be, quote-unquote, completely rational. If I was completely rational, I would never get out of bed in the morning, because I would be plagued by Humean doubts. It is only because I am irrational, and I irrationally care about such petty things as being on time for class. So, in other words, it is only because I and we all are driven by irrational emotions. That is why we have no time to sit around and wait for absolute certainty. Every moment of time we sit thinking is a moment we don't spend doing something more emotionally important, like looking for food, or being on time for class, or pick your favorite irrational motivation. So, to summarize this autobiographical digression, I've always found the hard problem of consciousness and the Turing Test, as well as Searle's Chinese room, deeply fascinating, but at the end of the day, completely irrelevant from the standpoint of any serious practical philosophy. So even though I was exposed to these ideas, and actually thought about them for quite some time, I was by no means an expert, especially in the sense that I haven't really done a literature review, so to speak. I haven't actually heard all sides of all the arguments. So recently I've been reading a book by Sean Carrol called The Big Picture. By the way, I think an excellent, excellent book. Even though the usual disclaimer, I don't agree with everything he says. But a wonderful book nonetheless, I think. So Sean Carrol, when he talks about Searle's Chinese room argument, he presents this systems reply. It's actually a very well-known reply, and I've heard it many times before. Mostly, I have to tell you, I've heard it from Jean Searle himself. Searle is giving a lot of talks, and his lectures are also widely available. So the systems reply goes like this. Of course, you do not understand the Chinese, but you are not the computer. You are, so to speak, just the central processor. And of course the central processor does not understand the Chinese. A functioning computer also has memory, like long-term memory, rapid access memory, all sorts of various interfaces, etc., etc. I mean, let's say a motherboard, and you're just a processor. Of course, you don't understand Chinese, and the processor doesn't understand Chinese, but the computer as a whole does. Or, in Searle's example, the room as a whole does. Now, Searle brushes off this reply in a single stroke, without giving it much credence or consideration. He says, well, okay, let's imagine I memorize the instruction manual, and now it's all in my head. And still, Searle says, yes, of course, it may take a lot of time to memorize this stuff, but you understand the difference between producing a bit of language that you do not understand and have simply memorized, and producing a bit of language from within yourself that you do understand and you do mean seriously. So I can say something like, Das ewige Schicksal, meine Herren und deine, a phrase in German from Goethe, but not being a fluent speaker of German, even though I can produce the phrase, does not mean I understand German. Something I have to keep reminding myself of. So basically, Searle says, that's it. Memorize the manual, you still do not understand Chinese. Now, again, parenthetically, let me note that actually, of all people, it was actually Jean Searle who made me a convinced physicalist. Because Searle, when he, not necessarily in print, in publications, but when he gives his lectures and when he discusses with his students, he explains that, of course, from a certain naturalist, biological, Darwinian standpoint, human brain just is a computer of a certain kind. And that his objection is not that computers cannot think in principle, but current computers cannot think because they are merely machines for symbol manipulation, whereas human brains are made in an entirely different way. And as Searle puts it, if you could actually reproduce the unique features of the brain, sometimes he talks about causal powers of the brain, then, of course, fine, a computer would be able to understand Chinese trivially the same way that a human being would be able to understand Chinese. Not to go on talking about this for too long, but still, again, Searle kind of proposes a different thought experiment. He says, imagine you need a replacement of a brain part, like a prosthetic limb, but for your brain. Searle says, imagine two scenarios. One is that a part of your brain, well, actually, you understand where this is going, right? The sheep of Theseus. You imagine your brain being substituted part by part by part, if you want, neuron by neuron, for artificial prosthetics. And Searle says, we can imagine two scenarios. Again, let me underscore. Searle himself is agnostic. He says, this is a test. We don't know what's going to come out on the other side of the test. Either, as your brain is gradually being replaced by machinery, you feel no change, and that means, yes, excellent. The neurosurgeon engineers have solved the hard problem of consciousness. and you can verify it from within your first-person ontology. Or, Searle could say, you could imagine a much more horrifying scenario where your behavior remains the same, so you continue acting in the very same fashion, and you can hear yourself talking from within your own head, but actually your consciousness gradually diminishes, and your control over your body gradually diminishes. So you observe a habitual behavior from your body, but you are paralyzed, not being able to communicate, trapped within your skull, and gradually your consciousness dissipates. Well, I say gradually, but of course you could imagine this to not be a gradual process, and just like you never wake up from brain surgery. Your body, in a zombie-like fashion, continues to function such that your body can pass the Turing test, and all of your friends and family recognize you, but you yourself, your first-person ontological, irreducibly subjective consciousness is not there anymore. Interesting thought experiment. I think maybe I should do a separate video on that. The reason why I find this fascinating, this experiment, is because actually if you think from a certain standpoint, I don't want to say Buddhist standpoint per se, but associated with certain strands of modern Buddhism. Like one of the goals of meditative practice of some people who call themselves Buddhists today is precisely to kind of get into the same kind of attitude to your body as it already exists right now, and to start feeling that your emotions and like automatic reactions of your body are not your own, but in a deep sense external to you, external and maybe even alien. Not exactly sure if this is the right phrase, but maybe you could say you start seeing your actions not as your actions, but as products of past karma, where karma refers to this causal structure, which is not you, but exists over and above you. Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the doctrine of non-self, Anatman. What would serious Buddhist philosophy say about the Chinese room and the Turing test? Interesting questions for another video. Apologies, digressions. Back to Searle. So, I was talking about the systems reply. Searle says, memorize the manual, you still don't know Chinese. Is this a good answer? I've always kind of assumed that it was an appropriate answer. But Sean Carrol changed my mind, or at least cast a long shadow of doubt to this reply. So, what's the deal? The human brain has, if I'm not mistaken, about 100 billion neurons. And in total, we're talking about something on the order of 100 trillion connections, which, by the way, develop organically and change over time. So the basic idea kind of goes something like this. Think of the H2O molecule, water molecule. Is it wet? An individual molecule is not wet, but a collection of molecules could be. So imagine taking a collection of molecules, let's say in the form of gas, water vapor, and then it condenses and undergoes a phase transition. So even though individual molecules are neither gaseous nor wet, systems of molecules can be gaseous or wet. And likewise, even though an individual neuron is probably not conscious, and Searle in his Chinese room is not conscious, but if a man in the Chinese room could reasonably perform the task at the required level of complexity, maybe something would emerge. Maybe yes, maybe no, but I think definitely an interesting possibility to think about. Again, I think the strength of Searle's example is its simplicity. Take a character in, look up the instructions in the manual, give a character back out. But that's not 100 billion neurons and not 100 trillion connections. What kind of a manual is that? How would you memorize that kind of manual? We're not talking about 2 weeks to compose a reply to a letter. We are talking maybe about 10 lifetimes to say one sentence. So let me immediately note, I don't think this is a knockdown criticism. There are no knockdown criticisms in philosophy. And in general, I think in philosophy, questions are more important than answers. So I think it's kind of important to keep this conversation moving forward. But still, let me try to elaborate on the systems reply a bit more. So again, to restate, I think, the basic objection, it goes as follows. Searle says, you can fairly easily, in a trivial fashion, simulate what the computer is doing. And the system's reply says no. The kind of complexity, the kind of computational complexity that a computer would have to achieve in order to convincingly speak Japanese is beyond, completely beyond, the reach of possibility of any individual human being. Searle could say, well, it's a difference only in quantity, because at the end of the day we're just manipulating zeros and ones, but I think that at least prima facie, at the first sight, we have to give the Turing people the benefit of the doubt. When you are talking about these kinds of quantities, maybe quantity does translate to quality. Again, this idea is broadly speaking known as emergence. Like, imagine it takes you 1 second to do a particular operation in the instruction manual, which is probably unrealistically fast, but let's just imagine for the sake of the experiment. But the kind of order of complexity that we get from neuroscience, and the kind of order of complexity that actual hardware would require, because I gotta remind people, at least right now in 2020, no computer actually can pass the Turing test. So we're not there yet. Even the computers that beat grandmasters at chess or Go, it's nothing compared to the real Turing test. So again, to go back to counting seconds, 1 second per operation. Let's imagine you need 1 billion operations. 1 billion seconds is 30 years, thank you very much. 30 years to maybe say 1 sentence, or to maybe write a reply of 1 letter. Again, in a human brain, you have 10 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections. So when I say 1 billion operations, this may be a gross underestimate. But that's not all. Let's continue. Sean Carrol gives the following example. He says, consider questions or sentences such as these. How are you doing? Why do you say that? Could you tell me more? So, indexical, contextual questions. Imagine 2 people talking. I, for example, can just use these 2 questions. Why do you say that? And could you tell me more? And just listen to your long and elaborate replies. Again, what kind of an instruction manual do you imagine that would be able to incorporate this kind of complexity? Again, let me pinpoint the issue. I could keep asking the same question over and over again, so through your little window in the Chinese room, you get the same characters. And the Chinese room would then be expected to produce different and elaborate replies to one and the same question, which at the very least implies that the Chinese room needs a way to store memories, to understand context, to know the tone of the conversation, to react according to what has been said previously in the conversation. Again, all of this is not something that you can trivially write in a manual, and all of this is not something that you can memorize, as Searle says in his systems reply to the systems reply, Okay. So I've been rambling on. I probably should be wrapping this up. So basically, what is the point of this video? Am I trying to say that Sean Carrol, or the systems reply in general, closes the door on the Chinese room argument? No, I don't think that's what I'm trying to say. And I think also very importantly, Sean Carrol himself does not think that this is the end of story, case closed. I mean, this is an ongoing debate and more importantly an ongoing research program. So I think what's really important is while we are waiting for the results of the neuroscience and engineering, so to speak, to come in, it is important to resist the temptation to jump to conclusion, and it is important to see both sides of the issue. What Sean Carrol invites us to do is to entertain the possibility that the emergence of consciousness can be explained simply in terms of this phase transition, which happens with the increase in levels of complexity. So, whereas an individual neuron is presumably unconscious, however, a system of neurons can reach a certain threshold. So, we do not know yet how this happens. But Sean Carrol urges us to seek a naturalist explanation, a naturalist answer. And moreover, that it is reasonable to expect that there will be someday a naturalist answer. The Chinese room argument supposedly looks like an argument for the impossibility of any kind of naturalist or physicalist answer to this question. And that's why undermining Searle's Chinese room is an important intellectual exercise. Now, this does not mean that Searle is wrong. Maybe at the end of the day, it will turn out that Searle was right all along. But it's just, that's not obvious at the moment. So again, we gotta keep looking. And in an important sense, time will tell whether the Chinese room argument is right or not. I mean, Searle himself, with his view of the world, which Searle calls biological naturalism, Searle actually urges us to treat consciousness as a problem in biology. And of course, if in 10, 20, or 100 years, thanks to the advances in neuroscience and engineering, we will actually find ourselves in a world with fully conscious robots, indistinguishable from ordinary human beings, at least in terms of outward behavior, then no doubt all of this is going to become a much, much more interesting question. Anyway, so I hope this was interesting. This was definitely a lot of fun for me, and I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts on the issue. So anyway, thanks for listening and take care.